I went camping a few months back in New Mexico with a friend of mine, David. There was a family there. If you like rustic desert scenery, there are few places in this country more beautiful than the Sandia Mountains northeast of Albuquerque. We spent a good part of our first day just hoofing it through the Cibola National Forest as we made our way towards the mountain range. We had plenty more ground to cover before we got to the foot of the mountains and not much daylight left, so we bivouacked down for the night when we found a place suitably less rocky than the majority of the trail had been. In the interest of travelling light, and for the simple fact that would be in a pretty dry climate, we didn't bring a tent with us, so our tiny camp was essentially 2 sleeping bags next to a fire pit where we cooked our dinner. Not long after sundown, we decided to call it a night, so we could wake up before dawn and get on the move before the day got too hot. A couple hours or so after I had managed to drift off to sleep, I woke up to the sound of my friend David's voice calling out to me. "Hey, over here, come take a look at this." I heard his voice trail off into the woods near the edge of the clearing. I looked around the camp to make sure I wasn't imagining things and saw David's sleeping bag was open and empty. I called back to him, sleepily asking what he'd found, but he'd just repeat himself. "Over here, come, take a look at this." In my bleary state, I didn't notice how strange his voice sounded at the time. Maybe I was just still half asleep, but looking back, it was pretty out of the ordinary, almost as if there were 2 voices layered on top of each other. One was clearly the voice of my friend, but the other was lower and significantly distorted. Groggily, I made my way out of my sleeping bag and slipped on my boots before walking into the darkness. I was nearly to the tree line when the voice called out again. "Over here, come, take a look at this." It was almost mechanical in its repetition, no shifting in tone or urgency, just that same flat bleep. As I started to shout back to him that I was coming, something grabbed my wrist from behind, then a second hand clasped over my mouth, stifling a short yelp of surprise. The grip of my wrist loosened as I spun to find David staring back at me, his eyes the size of dinner plates. He held one finger up to his lips and shook his head as he motioned with his free hand for me to follow him. I was confused, to say the least, but the look on his face told me that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. So I followed him back towards our little campsite. Once we arrived, he pointed at my pack and sleeping bag before quietly beginning to roll his own sleeping bag into a tight bundle. "What the fuck is going on, man?" I asked him, stupidly, as I stood in the middle of the clearing. He looked back at me with the same urgent expression and brought his finger back to his lips. Then he pointed at my sleeping bag again and made a rolling gesture. I'm pretty thick sometimes, but I understood his body language well enough to know that something had obviously spooked him. Enough to make him decide to pull up stakes and find a new spot to sleep in the middle of the night. So I collected my things and followed him into the woods. Back the way we came earlier that day, David didn't stop until we were clear of the trees and back out in the open almost an hour after we had started walking. He had told me that voice in the woods I heard was probably a skinwalker trying to lure me out into the forest. He explained that Cibola was a sacred place to the Navajo, and the skinwalkers who hunted there did so to defile its purity with death and dark magic. I was not buying it. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but I was pretty sure David was just trying to fuck with me. He was always a bit of a prankster, and I had fallen for a good number of his ruses, thick as I am. I was about to call him on his bullshit when I heard my own voice, clear as day, repeat the question I had asked him just before we left camp earlier that night. What the fuck is going on? I spun around to see 2 glowing red eyes peering back at me from the tree line about 20 paces behind us. David lit out running, and I followed him. We didn't stop until we were back at the truck in the parking lot near the entrance to the national park. We jumped into the cab, and after the engine puttered to life and turned over, and we peeled out of that parking lot to the screeching of rubber on asphalt, we didn't talk as we flew down the highway, but David's eyes kept creeping up to check the rearview mirror. So frequently, in fact, that when an enormous black, lumbering figure plodded into the headlights, he had to swerve at the last second to avoid it. "Oh my God, was that a bear?" I asked, knowing it was far too big to be a black bear and far too black to be a brown bear. He just shook his head and kept glancing nervously up into the rearview mirror as he redlined the old Ford's throttle. I watched his dark skin go pale as milk as his eyes locked on something in the rearview mirror. He turned to look through the back window and nearly sent us careening into a ditch, but I grabbed the wheel and straightened her out. What are you doing, man?" was all I could manage as I white-knuckled the steering wheel. "It's chasing us," he said flatly. "Get your hands on the fucking wheel," I screamed, as he returned his full attention to the task of driving again. I didn't want to look back, but I had to see it. Some part of me still didn't believe what was happening. Once I was sure David was focused on the road again, I glanced into the mirror on the passenger side. I saw those same glowing red orbs beaming from the pitch-black silhouette of the thing that was way too big to be a bear. It was no less than 20 yards behind us. I watched it rise from running on four legs to a standing position as it threw its head back and let out the most unearthly sound I had ever heard. It was like the drone of a siren mixed with a buzzing and chattering of forest full of insects. The old Ford's radio crackled to life, and the speakers in the car coughed up that same noise. The cacophony lasted for 5 ear-splitting seconds. Then it was over, and the only roar of the engine pervaded the silence of the night around us. We drove back to his family's place in Albuquerque and never spoke about what happened that night. Even now, as I write this, it still feels like some kind of horrible dream.